today, with all of you, we would like to discuss around this presentation of the roadmap for eradicating poverty beyond growth. I would like to start by recalling how the process developed. A couple of years ago, in 2024, I presented this report, which was titled Eradicating Poverty Beyond Growth, in which I tried to assess the reasons why growth was not delivering. And the report essentially offered a diagnosis that had at its first and key message that growth is not fulfilling its promises, first of all, because poverty persists. We have different ways of measuring poverty, and it's true that if we take a very low benchmark of extreme poverty based on the 3.10 US dollars per day in parity of purchasing power, some progress has been achieved, in particular thanks to the reduction of poverty in China and some parts of Asia. But if we take a realistic measure of poverty at, for example, $8.20 per day, we have today still 45% of the world's population in poverty. This is 3.6 billion people, and the figures are indeed increasing in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So poverty persists in a world of affluence, despite, in some countries, very strong growth. Moreover, inequalities are reaching a tipping point, and this was already referred to both by Laura Thompson and by Nada al-Nashif. Inequalities are now becoming a real liability for many countries, including the countries which have important growth rates. Inequalities are a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, because they make it more difficult to achieve the ecological transition. The more unequal a society is, the more growth is needed to reduce poverty, because less of the growth will benefit people in poverty if inequalities persist. Moreover, if you have high levels of inequality, the machine of the economy will not serve the right ends, the right needs. The production will serve the demand expressed by the richest groups of the population who have the highest purchasing power, and as a result, we will build large mansions, supersized cars, and a number of services will be provided that serve the rich rather than the basic needs of people in poverty. Moreover, as we know from the work of economists and social psychologists, inequalities result in modes of consumption that are not sustainable, and they put pressure on everyone to mimic the lifestyles of those who are richer and higher in the social ladder. This puts an unsustainable pressure on the environment. Inequality is also becoming a political liability, and one of my earlier reports discussed the rise of far-right populism in the context of the weakening of social protection, and I tried to show that the current backsliding of democracy in a number of countries can be attributed to social anxiety, the fear of falling behind, the fear about the future that people experience when we weaken social protection rather than providing economic security. And finally, inequalities are having impacts on mental health. I published a report on the burnout economy, showing how the pressure on workers leads to psychosocial risks for workers, and how, in general, inequalities result in social anxiety, depression, developing at a very worrying pace. The report I presented in 2024 also noted that green growth is not happening. Of course, we have some countries amongst the richest and those with per capita greenhouse gas emissions that are the highest in the world that have managed to grow while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And that, I think, is the result of the green and clean technologies we must continue to invest in. However, environmental collapse is not simply about climate change. There are not one, but 9 planetary boundaries, 7 of which now have been passed. There were only 3 that were passed in 2009 when this compass for environmental sustainability was introduced by the Stockholm Brazilian Center. And we know from studies, for example, led by Timothée Parikh or Joachim Vogel and Jason Hickel, that green growth is not happening. The more you grow the economy, the more the metabolism of the economy increases, the more energy you consume, the more resources you use, and the more waste and pollution you produce, including, but not only, greenhouse gas emissions responsible for global climate change. So the report I presented said we need something else. We need to reimagine the fight against poverty, and we need to take a different compass for action. And I'm delighted that we have now, within the United Nations system, a momentum towards measuring progress differently, moving beyond GDP as a measure of progress. Now, this was already stated in the SDGs. Target 17.19 encourage countries to adopt measures of progress beyond GDP. The Pact for the Future, adopted on 22nd of September 2024, requested that a high-level expert group be established on beyond GDP, and the conclusions of that high-level expert group will be presented on 6th of May. We all look forward to that compass for measuring progress. They will present a dashboard of indicators for equitable, inclusive, and sustainable well-being, and that's extremely important. But if we do not draw the lessons from the measurement that we provide, we will fail to effectuate the changes that are needed. So we need to be much more imaginative, and we need to realize that if we focus on growth, economic growth, increasing GDP as a condition for everything else, as a passage obligé, as a condition sine qua non for social progress and for environmental sustainability, we will fail. It's a detour that we should be very cautious about. In fact, what we see is that we hope that growth will deliver jobs, will improve well-being, will allow countries to reimburse their debt, will allow to finance social protection. But as we see the increase of the GDP, economic growth, as a precondition for all this, we make policy choices that end up being counterproductive. We flexibilize labour markets at the expense of workers' rights. We introduce labour-saving technologies that, in fact, put people out of jobs and are often very energy-intensive. We shape a business-friendly investment climate, which is in fact a code word for saying we reduce taxes on corporate income and we deregulate corporations, and we pursue trade liberalization, fragilizing workers in the least competitive sectors of the economy. We reward types of innovation that will not bring well-being, that will not create jobs, but that will increase the GDP if that is our compass. And so the result is precarious work, growing inequalities, a burnout economy with the growth of depression and anxiety rates all over the world, the modernization of poverty in which as essential needs are satisfied, people are excluded because the general affluence rises and the social expectations about consumption change, and we have, of course, environmental breakdown. And this is why the OECD experts in the 2022 report Beyond Growth towards a new economic approach said whatever progress is expected from higher GDP can often be harmed by the ways it is generated, particularly for those on lower incomes and in more precarious work, and where private consumption is prioritized over public goods. So that is, if you wish, the why we must change. And what we must do, I try to capture by saying that we need to move beyond the classic approach to reducing poverty, which is a three-step sequence in which we grow the economy, we then tax corporations and and high-income individuals and wealthy households, and then we finance public services and social protection. And that is how historically welfare states were built. And we must continue to fight for this to be preserved and indeed strengthened. That is the classic way of combating poverty and inequalities through post-market redistribution. However, we must be more imaginative, we must do more. We must also move to reshaping the markets so that they become inclusive and sustainable by design, rather than simply remedying post hoc the damage caused by the way the market operates. We should reform markets by, for example, supporting the social and solidarity economy, one of the proposals in the roadmap, or by rethinking public procurement so that the companies that perform the best on social and environmental indicators are given priority for public contracts. And then we must invest in social investment to tackle not only transient poverty but also chronic poverty. We must break the vicious cycles that perpetuate poverty from one generation to the next. Invest more in housing, education, healthcare, nutrition, so that we avoid a situation in which being raised in poverty is a life sentence imposed on the child for a crime that he or she did not commit. That is social investment. It should complement the ex post approaches to compensate the losers. It should complement the in-market measures to make markets more inclusive and sustainable. It means addressing poverty ex ante, preventing it rather than allowing it to persist. It is based on those assumptions that we move with the roadmap from the why we must change and the what we must do to the how question. How can we get there? How can we bridge the distance between the short-term measures we must take here and now to respond to the poly crisis and the long-term vision of a world that is sustainable and that has eradicated poverty and reduced inequalities? And that was a challenge we submitted to a very large number of NGOs, unions, academic experts, social movements, and UN agencies. We had a large number of meetings over the past 18 months. The people involved are too many to cite. There were 400 people who contributed to this roadmap in total. And what we did was try to link the proposals to one another so that we see how they can be mutually supportive and how the different measures in these 5 thematic areas can be complementary and can be aligned from the short-term measures we need to take now and the long-term measures that will become possible once the right conditions will have been created. The process of the roadmap is more like music than it is like architecture. It's not just about a grand and generous vision. It's also about the different steps that we should take to get there, in which every note counts, and in which the short-term measures we take in response to the crisis will lead us closer to this end vision we are seeking to pursue. That was the hope, and these 5 thematic pillars have a chapeau, a rooftop, if you wish. That is how we govern the transition. How can we move from more or less democratically governed states to democratizing the economy, to identifying the right indicators, to developing the right national strategies that will allow us to implement this transition. Imagine states adopting national anti-poverty strategies that, seeking inspiration from the various 80 measures proposed in the roadmap, gradually roll out poverty reduction action plans, national anti-poverty strategies, and gradually move towards fulfilling this vision in which we will combat poverty without relying on growing the economy further. That is the idea. Now, there are many fantasies about this roadmap and misunderstandings. I'd like to make 4 remarks concerning the objectives we were pursuing. The first one is, Obviously, this is not one single menu that all states are forced to seek inspiration from. All countries, I mean, each country has to face different circumstances. The policy tools, the enriched policy toolbox that the roadmap provides contains a range of measures that will be more or less relevant to particular national circumstances. And our hope is that governments will design their national anti-poverty strategies by choosing or identifying within the roadmap what is most relevant to their circumstances. So it's one challenge, of course, but it's many recipes depending on national circumstances. Secondly, the idea is that we cannot do everything at once. And we must bridge this gap between the utopias of long-term visions and the short-term measures we must take here and now. But what we must ensure is that those short-term measures fit within a broader plan which requires from countries that they adopt multi-year strategies to move away from growth dependency. Thirdly, the different reforms can be mutually supportive, so the different pillars of the roadmap are interdependent. And in particular, low-income countries, developing countries, may need a number of changes to be made in the international environment for their domestic efforts to be enabled. And I will return to this. I think it's important to realize that those reforms must be mutually supportive and not everything can be done at once. And finally, as to the content, I think it's fair to summarize the 80 measures of the roadmap by saying there's an eco-social dimension and there's a decolonial dimension. There's an eco-social dimension because the attempt is really to identify ways to combat poverty and inequalities without growth, in other terms, without further impacting the environment and accelerating the environmental collapse. That means not only moving away from the most commonly used tool to combat poverty, which is ex post redistribution, it also means decommodifying goods and services essential for a dignified life, so that access to those goods and services will not depend as much as they do today on purchasing power, on income levels. It means reshaping the economy so that the resources are used to address poverty, to meet the needs of people in poverty, and that requires democratic planning. It's not about recession. It's not about an economic downturn we would manufacture. It's the very opposite. It's choosing what we want to grow and what we want to see degrow. It's making a democratic choice as to what ends the economy would serve. So do not confuse, please, post-growth with accepting that recession is going to guide our choices in the future. It is actually the very opposite. It's something that we must choose democratically. It is not something we must endure. Fourth and finally, we have a number of proposals concerning work and care and support, better valuing care and support, establishing job guarantee programs, ensuring for all workers living wages and a fair remuneration are to us absolutely vital. And I would like to salute the work, essential work of the ILO in this area, particularly that of Sharar Zavi, who's been a supporter of the mandate since the start. I think it's absolutely key, and we must identify the gaps that remain and work towards addressing those gaps. I did a report on the working poor that tries to identify some ways forward. Now, when we developed this roadmap, we systematically received two questions. One, what about developing countries, low-income countries in particular? Can they do without growth? Let me be very clear. They cannot. They have not only a right but a duty to shape development to improve the well-being of their populations. But growth as it is today is not serving them. Growth as it is today is extractive, based on the use of their natural resources, and it's exploitative, based on the exploitation of cheap and compliant workers in the global south. That cannot persist. I went to countries, which I will not name, who told me we cannot raise wages because we will be less attractive to investors. We will be less interesting in global supply chains, right? That is simply not sustainable. You cannot have your comparative advantage based on keeping your population in poverty. And so the post-growth project, the roadmap, is a decolonial project. And I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart the work done by Jason Hickel on this topic. He has been, of all authors, the most explicit on this idea. The roadmap has many measures that actually serve the development imperative in the Global South. We believe that they should escape a model of development that is premised on the idea that the only way to grow is to export for global markets and accede to the high-value markets of OECD countries. Countries develop in that way today because they face a high foreign debt, and they can only reimburse that debt by exporting in order to have access to dollars, the high-value currencies on which their debt is labeled. That is not sustainable. They need to work to satisfy the local needs, and they have to imagine a development process that will be less dependent on satisfying demand from OECD countries. That means we must address the debt issue. We must promote South-South trade, and we have many proposals in this regard. We also should support social investment in the Global South. We have been fighting tirelessly to insist that low-income countries should receive more support for social protection, for social investment. For example, by a new issuance of special drawing rights by the IMF based on need rather than on quotas, or for example, by solidarity levies that can support a new financing mechanism for social protection in the Global South. And the roadmap also has proposals on climate justice, particularly on how to finance a loss and damage fund 2.0. Now, the second question we often have is this affordable? How are you going to finance this? In the next few weeks, we will publish a separate policy brief on this. The answer we have is easy to summarize in 4 sentences. First, preventing poverty and ill health is less expensive than addressing it ex post. So we can save money by investing money in protecting people from poverty. Secondly, we can finance public services, social protection, as we do today by raising taxes on income, but that creates a growth dependency that is very problematic. So we can finance differently by fiscal reform, addressing building public revenue by taxing wealth and inheritance rather than income, taxing the ills of the economy, for example, the extraction of fossil fuels, and that is how we can be both socially progressive and promote environmental sustainability. I was mesmerized in my report of 2021 on the perpetuation of poverty across generations to see how very few countries had taxes on inheritance, and even those who have such taxes know that they are very easy to circumvent. Thirdly, social investment may look like a cost to the ministries of finance, but it is in fact an investment with very high returns in the medium to long term. There is no better way for a country to escape poverty than to invest in its people, building human capital. Fourth and finally, monetary policy could be put in the service of the social and ecological transition. Today, most of the money is created by private banks who provide finance to profitable projects. That does not serve the social purpose of money creation. We could do better, and we have very precise proposals on the use of monetary policies with this philosophy. We hope that the roadmap will have a future. I very much count on the Global Coalition for Social Justice to continue to reflect on this and to encourage countries to make reforms inspired by the roadmap. I know that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, thank you again, Nada, for the support for my mandate. It's been extremely important to be able to count on the office's support. I know that the Human Rights Economy Project, which is really what this roadmap seeks to contribute to, is a hugely important lever to make progress on this. In the immediate next few months, I will advocate for countries to adopt national anti-poverty strategies and to seek inspiration from the roadmap in this regard. I will, like some others in this room, involve myself in the International Panel on Inequality that will define its program of work in the next few days in Johannesburg. And I will insist that working group number 4, which is on policy options to reduce inequalities, will use the roadmap as a source of inspiration. I believe that the just transition mechanism agreed upon at COP30 in Belém under the UNFCCC framework can benefit from looking at the roadmap for proposals and evidence. The report of the high-level expert group on Beyond GDP will lead, we hope, to a debate within the General Assembly, which I hope will go beyond indicators to also look at what lessons we must learn from indicators that tell us that we are moving in the wrong direction. I also hope that the Global Sustainable Development Report to support the 2027 SDG Summit will take the roadmap into account. And finally, we will establish, hopefully, a new body, the New Economies for Eradicating Poverty, the NEP mechanism, to continue to monitor the implementation of this roadmap in the future. I conclude, there is a momentum on Beyond GDP, on fighting inequalities and recognizing the climate emergency, on the need to reimagine the fight against poverty to prevent further political backlash. There is a way to do so. The roadmap shows the way. We can combat poverty without depending on growth. This will require political will, new alliances that will have to be built across different constituencies, and long-term thinking. And it will require a new type of wisdom. Imagine this older woman in a rural vicinity in some parts of the global south, and she has a reputation of being a very wise person. And this smart teenage boy comes to her and boasts with his friends that he will show that she is not that wise. And he captures a small bird in his hands. And he will go to this old woman and say, look, is the bird alive or is the bird dead? And of course, if the woman says the bird is alive, the boy will just squeeze his hands and kill the bird. And if she says the bird is dead, he will open his hands and the bird will be alive, will be shown to be alive. And the woman says, my dear friend, the answer is in your hands. Thank you very much.